Dinner, a man in the faded green of the railway company said, pressing a tin tray covered with foil into Mitsue's hands. What? Mitsue's voice fell clumsily into the hall. He fumbled with the tray as if drugged. His thoughts lumbered through his head. The man seemed to be shouting, though Mitsue thought it was only the ache in his skull. Dinner. Food, the man said. You know, for putting in your face. Now this is a military train, so these are military rations. Not your mother's cooking. Still. He looked closer at Mitsue. Say, you aren't from around here, are you? Thank you, Mitsue said hurriedly, taking the tray firmly in his hands and stepping back into the compartment. Without looking at the man, he slid the door shut. He heard a scoff and then the sound of the man's footsteps retreating down the corridor. Sorry, Mitsue thought, gazing down at the tray. The man's curiosity had seemed innocuous enough. It was just that Mitsue was tired of explaining himself. His whole life he'd had to deal with it, the stares, inquisitive or acrimonious or anything in between. Then the questions. Where are you from? When did you move here? His mouth always sandy dry as he stuttered out an answer. Many Anglian soldiers had gone north to Tsukihaka during the war. Many of them had never returned. Sons, daughters, the youth of the nation bleeding out in some far-flung north that most had never heard of, and even fewer were interested in. It wasn't so bad. Most people weren't openly hostile, but there were some. A pretzel vendor in the streets of Layton, a mailman once when Mitsue came to the door, a crew unloading a truck, then a glare, some searing words, an accusation in their eyes. Lost my nephew up there. Should go back where you came from. Dirty skink. Dr. and Mrs. Ashford had always intervened whenever they heard, but they didn't always hear. It was easier not to engage. Mitsue sat on the edge of the bunk and peeled the foil back. The tray was divided into 4 compartments. There was a pile of slimy sliced peaches, a dense mound of peas, a dry ham sandwich, and a small, dusty lump of chocolate. The sight of food made his stomach squirm. He had absolutely no appetite. Still, he knew he should eat something. His last meal had been lunch the day before at St. Trenet's. That morning, Clyde had offered him breakfast, knocking and calling through the door of the bedroom where Mitsue had stayed holed up. But Mitsue hadn't wanted to have to speak, to compress all his nebulous pieces swirling around the room, and so he'd remained silent, waited for Clyde to leave, only exiting the room when it was time to make their way to the train station. He hefted the fork in his hand and stabbed a peach. Juice squirted from the holes. He closed his eyes. Maybe the peas. But these were so wet and mushy that he had to spit them out immediately. The sandwich? The bread seemed stale and the cheese dry, but among his options it was the least repulsive. He managed to eat half of it before he realized the smoked ham smelled exactly like Ernley's burns. Then it was all he could do to keep what he'd eaten down. He dropped the remainder of the sandwich back onto the tray and pushed the whole thing beneath his bunk. Afterwards, he lay back and stared up at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the train, the mutter of the engine, the moans of air whipping past outside, the windows rattling in their frames. He dozed and woke and dozed some more, sinking into memories, then breaking to the surface. He saw his home, his parents, the moonlight and the sakura blossoms as they fell, his father across the dojo's polished wood floor. Again, his father said. Beside the open shutters, his mother sang a sad, sweet song. Mitsue ran barefoot across a wide, grassy field, the rice paddies like silver mirrors beneath him, steep paper mountains huddled all around, a sheen of cloud arcing across the sky. He floated on the bunk in the train car hurtling along the track, skimming over his past, and there, between the waking world and the world of dreams, strange thoughts wandered, blossoming and then wilting. He fell into the porcelain cup from which his mother drank her tea, the cracks in the sides repaired with lacquer and gold, and he surfaced in the brown and gold eyes of his dog Haru. And the wetness in those eyes was the lashing rains that fell sideways when typhoons shook the timbers of the night. The cicadas roared in the trees, and in their sound he could hear Rei's voice. She was talking to him, whispering something secret, something he couldn't understand, in words that weren't words, and her voice became the crackling of a fire. Mrs. Ashford lay stretched on a wooden platform, the light beating at her edges and gathering in the folds of her white robes, her body drifting away in the smoke and the ash and the heat, her body becoming the heat, the fire, as if the human heart and the mind and the soul were only energy. And he wandered the fire, through the blown-out streets of Sotsu, and screams rent the air, and the screams were the whistle of the train and the squeal of the brakes.